This morning we are continuing our consideration of this idea of general revelation. All right, so this is actually the third installment that we've done on this subject, and last week we took a week off too. So I will remind you that so far we've seen, in my opinion, some pretty potent evidence that an infinite and personal God does exist, and that he is a creator God. And so I'm not going to really belabor that point any more than we already have. And so we have already looked at just a couple of lines of evidence. There are several more lines of evidence than that, and you should look into those if you're interested in these kinds of things. I'll help you if you would like some direction. But for this morning, we're just going to accept that this point has already been made. Okay, but as soon as you acknowledge the likelihood of an infinite and personal creator God, another question that's kind of a big one pops up right away. And that is this problem of evil. All right, and so this is pretty easily the premier argument that's raised up against the biblical idea of an infinite personal God. And so any website or book that's trying to put down the idea that there might be a God inevitably camps out on this idea. And so it's really important for those of us that are Christians to be conversant with this issue and to have some biblical answers to this kind of question. And so I think that this issue is answered biblically and in an extremely satisfying way. In fact, in my opinion, this question is answered in a more satisfactory way biblically than any other worldview can manage. All right, but you have the opportunity to judge that for yourself. So here are the issues that need to be addressed. And so if God's the creator of the world and he's supposedly so good, then how come the world that he created is so evil? Okay, that's a pretty good question. Christianity says that God is all-powerful and God is all good, and yet evil still exists. And so last week, it wasn't actually last week, it was last time, but a couple of weeks ago, I argued that if you're inconsistent with your own presuppositions, then there's something wrong. And so critics would say that I am being inconsistent with my presuppositions by saying that. And so if God was really all-powerful, then he would be able to stop evil. And if God was really all good, then he would want to stop evil. And yet, evil is here. So both of those things that we say about God can't really be true. And the argument is that there's an internal contradiction in the idea that an all-powerful and all-good God exists just for the fact that evil exists. And so it seems like we might want to address this one. All right, we don't really want to get taken down with an argument that we put on the table. Okay, so we're going to want to look at what God has done in the world about the existence of evil and relate it to these questions, because this idea really does come up in Romans chapter 1. All right, and so this photo may not be super clear, and maybe that's for the best in this setting. This is sort of an iconic World War II photograph that was taken during the German occupation of the Ukraine, and it's a picture of a German soldier who's about to shoot a Jewish prisoner in the head. And the picture was found with the caption written on the back, "The last Jew in Vinnytsia or Vitsia or something. I don't know how to say it. But there's a pile of bodies already in the hole, and there's a bunch of soldiers standing around just watching. And so I don't really care about the circumstances or which side did what for the sake of the argument that we're making here today. Whatever else the details are surrounding this photograph, we're looking at the naked truth that evil does exist. Okay, this is not just some evolutionary hiccup that is maladapted for our species. We're looking at a thing here that is morally wrong and that shouldn't happen. And so most of us have lived pretty sheltered lives comparatively, and it can be easy for us to lose sight of the scope of real evil that exists in the world. And the proof of that sheltering is that some of us will actually argue that humans are fundamentally good. Okay, I think that's a hard one to swallow if you look at the entirety of the world and the entirety of time. Okay, but I think that brings us to a point that's where we need to start here, and that is that people like to point out that evil's kind of a big problem for theists or for Bible believers. And it is, all right? It's something that needs to be addressed. But it's not just a problem for Christians. This is a problem for anyone, no matter what their worldview is. And so I touched on this the last time that we were here. And so if we look at the problem of evil, and if you're an atheist or a naturalist, so these are views that reject the idea that God exists, and what explanation do they have for evil, right? They actually have their own set of problems talking about this, all right? They can't even really say what evil is, okay? Under any materialist model, anything that is right. So lions kill antelope. Sometimes lions kill lions. Nobody gets put in prison. It's all natural, right? That's just the way of the world. And humans are no different. Whatever is right. And so atheism has no basis for saying that anything at all is evil. And at most, they could argue that some things might be disadvantageous or whatever to the survival of our species. But then there's the question of why our species, right? Why should our species be the one that survives? And, who cares if they do anyway? And so you can actually make a pretty good case from the naturalist viewpoint for eliminating any infirm or genetically imperfect members of the species, okay, in order to benefit the survivability of the species in the long run. And when naturalists have taken control of governments, this is exactly the way they have acted in some cases. And so atheist thinkers like Stalin and Mao have killed a whole bunch of people throughout history. And so, it's true that a ton of decent-sized atrocities have been committed by religious people and even Christians, but nothing like what the naturalists have done. Okay, so atheists and naturalists do take the cake when it comes to atrocities. And it's really, shouldn't surprise us very much, because they believe that humans are just material. Okay, there's no good reason not to kill anyone that you want to. And so if we think about this same thing in regard to pantheism, we talked about this a little bit last time too. Pantheism has a God that is in all and through all, and that includes things that are evil. And so God is part of that Jewish guy that's about to be shot in the head, but God is equally part of the soldier with the gun. And so that's why the great Eastern thinkers like to argue that these dichotomies, like good and evil, are really just unenlightened thinking. And if people just understood properly, then they would see that this is all just part of the all. All right, and so that's kind of a problem. All right, they don't even believe that the evil that we think that we can perceive is real. So we live in a Maya, which is a Sanskrit word that means illusion. And so this whole world is not really happening. Okay, there's a denial of the evil that we have here. And karmic law pretty much explains away all of the misfortunes that people have. And so the Jewish guy kneeling at the edge of the mass grave had it coming for something that he did in some previous life. So there's really not any basis for taking a strong stand against evil. Everybody's just getting what they deserve. It's kind of a problem. And then there's animism. All right, so this is the predominant view in the world today. All right, so numerically, more people are animistic than any other faith category. And in the animist's view of evil, there's just no problem with evil. And in animism, the gods are also evil. So you can study any culture's mythology or their folklore, and you'll find that the gods do the same things that the humans do. Okay, so there's really no basis at all for any real evaluation of this problem of good or evil. And they think that everything that happens is the result of spirits influencing things. Okay, so they do have taboos. Okay, but taboos are different than moral thinking. Taboos are not principles that can be taken into different situations and applied there like a moral norm can. Taboos are specific to a particular behavior by a particular tribe of people. And so taboos are like not doing your laundry on the second Wednesday of the month so that you don't offend the god of laundry or whatever. Okay, so most thinkers agree that taboos do not qualify as morality in the sense of the word that we use it. And so no matter where you turn in the world, it's not like we're getting awesome answers to this problem that are completely satisfying. Okay, and that's an important thing for us to keep in mind. And so when someone comes at you all aggressively because you're a Christian and asks you to explain the problem of evil, ask them if they can explain the problem of evil from their point of view. Okay, I would be really surprised if you got a satisfactory answer. Okay, so any answer at all that you can provide from Christianity would probably be better than what you can get outside of Christianity. I already did that one. All right, so let's look at this from the point of view of biblical theism. And so there's a little bit of a difference between biblical theism and other sorts of theism that are not based on the Bible, but I'm talking here specifically about theism that is based on the Bible. And so the first thing that we have to come to grips with is the notion of personhood. So a personal being is a being that is created at a very high order. All right, they have self-awareness, and we should recognize that we are this way. Okay, we can say that we're aware of our own lives. We're aware that we have a presence and a history and a future. And research indicates that other animals don't really have this. Okay, it's safe to assume that this is uniquely human. And we see humans behave in ways that are more destructive and more evil than other species. And so this also suggests that there's something different about us, like that picture that was up. Okay, it is extremely rare in other species to see something like that. Okay, it's simple brutality for no good reason. All right, and that actually does square with the biblical view that we are highly sophisticated spiritual beings that are in a fallen state. Okay, we're not just capable of higher good, but also lower evils than a normal material organism would be capable of. And without the biblical explanation of human beings created as distinct from other animals, we're left with this natural macroevolutionist theory thing. And if that is the case, then where are all of the intervening species that would be between humans and the next nearest thing to us? And so in a huge number of areas, we stand out as this distant oddball in the animal kingdom. All right, so in areas like intellect. Okay, so if you had a graph that plotted the relative intelligence of every species of animal on Earth, there would be a lot of points on that graph. And the curve of the graph would be fairly smooth. Okay, the distance between like adjacent points on the graph would be so close that really only an expert could tell you the difference between any two species. And even those experts would disagree about which species was more intelligent a lot of the time. And so there's a lot of debate around the world about what the second most intelligent creature on Earth is. Okay, most still agree that it's the chimpanzee, but it could be something else. There are other candidates. But it's hard to really tell which one is the second most intelligent species on Earth. And then there's this one point way up on the graph that is hugely far away from the other points. Okay? We are way more intelligent than anything else. And you would think that if naturalism were the way of things, then there would be some intervening steps along the way there. Okay, there's no species anywhere that stands out like we do in any feature at all, really. It's not just intelligence. And so whatever feature you name, there's nothing else that's very close to the species that's at the top. But in this area of intelligence, humans are just way out of the ballpark, okay, of anything else. And this is not at all what would be expected in a purely naturalistic model. And so the Bible declares that God imbued human beings with a spirit, and that made them qualitatively different than anything else in the animal world. All right, they're made in his own image. He fashioned them after himself. And so the facts that we're talking about fit the biblical picture, but they do not fit the materialistic picture. All right, and so everywhere that you go on Earth, humans are exactly the same in some very important ways that are not true of other animals. Humans are all interfertile, okay, which is a little bit weird for animals. Okay, so also all cultures and societies have some kind of religion or belief in an afterlife. We've never actually found a culture that doesn't have something like this. Okay, and people are all of the same intellectual capacity as a group or as a culture. Okay, and so we also all have moral notions. There's no group of humans anywhere in the world that does not have some sense of morality or believe that there should be a moral standard of some kind. Okay, aesthetic fascination is worldwide in people. Humans kind of have a thing about like creativity and beauty. They spend huge amounts of time or money pursuing these things. And so this is true here in the West, but it's just as true in other parts of the world. And it's just as true throughout all of history. Even the most primitive tribes spent a ton of time in carving and painting and weaving and tattoos. Okay, there were all these ways that they spent time creating beauty. And this is an activity that does not put food on the table, okay, or a roof over your head. It kind of seems like a waste of time. But it fits perfectly with the notion that we're created in the image of God, who is also very creative and who also has a sense of beauty. And so personhood is kind of an important idea when we're talking about this kind of thing. But why? Right? Why is it so important? What makes this such an important point? This verse is from Genesis, and it says that, so God created people in his own image. God patterned them after himself, male and female. He created them. So that's the beginning point. Okay, and so you have to come to grips with the fact that when we're dealing with humans, we're dealing with a being that's created in the image of God. And that makes it firstly true that only a personal being can even do something that's evil. And so I brought up earlier that it's not evil for a lion to kill a lion or for it to kill a gazelle. Those are not moral events in any way. In order to be capable of evil, you have to be a personal being. And to be personal implies that we are non-programmed beings. Okay, we're capable of making decisions and making choices that are free. And therefore, we are culpable for those choices. And so, like if my son is beating my daughter with a stick, I don't grab the stick and start lecturing the stick. Okay, it's just a stick. It's just an object. It doesn't do anything on its own. The stick's not culpable for what it was involved in. The personal being that is wielding the stick is the one that's responsible, and that's not at all hard to see. Okay, but a lot of people ask the question, why didn't God just create free choosing beings that never choose evil? So help me out here. Is that what free choosing means? Okay, if we have to choose well, then we're not choosing. So it's nonsense, all right? To be a personal being, you can't be pre-programmed, and you can't be a machine that must choose a certain thing or that's compelled to do certain things. And so this idea is inseparable from being a personal being. But if you open the door to freedom, then anything can happen, and anything does happen. All right, and that's exactly the door that God opened. We have freedom of choice. But then you have to admit that beings that are capable of choosing anything might sometimes choose evil things. And if the choice for evil is made, then who is it that's responsible for that evil? Well, if the choice is freely made, then the one making the choice is the one responsible for what's done. So the concept of responsibility is linked directly to freedom of choice. Okay? Without freedom of choice, if people are being made to do what they do, then they're not culpable. They're not responsible. And the Bible maintains that, even after we have fallen, a substantial amount of freedom does remain in our choices. And so we're taught in the Bible that a long time ago, humans chose to break with God. They chose to go their own way. They thought they had a better way than God's way. And so that's what we're referring to as the fall. And it perfectly explains the way that humans are. And so now all humans are born already fallen. And we're taught by the Bible that we're born with a tendency or like an inner damage that causes us to tend towards selfishness and to tend away from following God and to dislike authority and to take what we want with violence if necessary. And so the question comes up, how should God respond to us? What do you think that God should do since he's created free choosing beings and they have chosen to create this hellish situation where people just rampage all over the world and we're all just looking out for ourselves? Right? What should God do? Let's bring our picture back up. Look at the guy with the gun here and even his buddies that are looking on. What should God do to these guys? Right, what do you think he should do? Is doing nothing an option? Right? When these guys come to God after they're dead, should God just kind of wag his finger and say, I guess boys will be boys, but whatever, it's okay, come on in? Would that be satisfactory, do you think? Maybe he should reward them. Okay, it's kind of the area, it's kind of the place where universalists end up. All right, they put it out there that God is like so sweet and loving that, everybody gets to go to heaven. He would never do anything that was mean, like judge people or something like that. Really? For shooting unarmed people and dumping their bodies in a hole, there's no answer except like, come on in and get your reward? Seem right to you? Maybe God should apologize for creating this awful situation that caused you to be the way that you are, or that caused this soldier to have to shoot these people. A lot of people think that God should say that he's sorry. And if you take away the responsibility that humans have, then who would be responsible? Kind of would be God. All right, so I can see the reasoning there. On the other hand, if this guy is not being made to do what he's doing, and he did choose to do it, then this is like a whole different picture. And then I don't see God apologizing for anything. And so the Bible says that none of these responses are correct. The thing that's actually going to happen is that God's going to judge. And he's going to hold this man accountable for the things that he did. Okay, all of humanity can anticipate the judgment of God. And that is because there is freedom, and so there is responsibility. And if there's responsibility, then there's culpability. And so therefore, God will judge people who are guilty. And so if we bring back our slide that has the beliefs of the biblical theism worldview, we can add that humanity does now stand under the judgment of God. Which brings us to our passage in Romans today. Okay, this is Romans 1:21 and on. It says, yes, they knew God, but they wouldn't worship him as God or even give him thanks. And they began to think up foolish ideas of what God was like. As a result, their minds became dark and confused. Claiming to be wise, they instead became fools. And instead of worshiping the glorious, ever-living God, they worshiped idols made to look like mere people and birds and animals and reptiles. Sounds a little bit like the history of the world. We kind of sense that there's like an infinite, transcendent, maybe personal God there, but that's a little bit scary for our autonomy especially. And so we come up with something that's easier to manage. And we do things like carve up a tree and stand that tree up and bow down to that tree. And then we cut up the other half of the tree and we cook our dinner with it. Okay, and so that illustration is from Isaiah, and it's a good one. And we kind of need to get a grip, all right? We're desperate to worship anything but God, and we always have been. We do the exact same thing today with the work of our hands. We worship the things that we make, and we worship comfort, and we worship security. And so really nothing has changed at all. Anything except the true God. Okay, the God that speaks and the God who judges. We don't want anything to do with the real God. Therefore, God gave them over in the lusts of their heart to impurity, so that their bodies would be dishonored among them. And so what's God going to do with people that refuse to acknowledge him? People that refuse to give thanks and that would rather worship a piece of stone? Is he going to shoot flames out of heaven and consume them? No, it's way worse than that. He just lets them go, and he lets them do things their own way. And that turns out to be a pretty intense judgment. Okay, he gives them over. We read 3 times in this passage that he gave them over. For they exchanged the truth of God for a lie, and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator. And so we know that there's a Creator, but we would rather worship something that is less than the Creator. We worship things that the Creator made. We prefer to worship things that we know perfectly well, that they're not God. Because of this, God gave them over to shameful lusts. When they refused to acknowledge God, he gave them over to their evil minds and let them do things that should never be done. Right? There it is again. Their lives became full of every kind of wickedness, sin, greed, hate, envy, murder, fighting, deception, malicious behavior, and gossip. Kind of sounds like the front page of the paper or watching the nightly news. They are backstabbers, haters of God, insolent, proud, and boastful. They are forever inventing new ways of doing evil and are disobedient to their parents. They refuse to understand, break their promises, and are heartless and unforgiving. And those are some of their better points. It's a pretty good description of humanity we got going on here. They are fully aware of God's death penalty for those who do these things, yet they go right ahead and do them anyway. And worse yet, they encourage others to do them too. So the Bible's telling us that the whole human race, this is not just people other than us, this is all of us. We're like hopelessly mired in personal sin and evil because we've turned away from God, and He has just let us go. And so this brings us to our sin graph. So you all recognize this thing. This is how you organize the various levels of sin in your own mind. Okay? And we can probably all agree that shooting a defenseless old man is pretty freaking bad. Okay, I didn't put it at the top because I bet we can all think of something that's worse than that. Okay, but this is pretty disgusting. And on the other hand, there's my lying and my selfishness and my disrespect for God. Maybe it's just you're living your own way, or your preoccupation with financial security, or your self-righteousness. Whatever it is, it's not like I'm saying that it's okay or that I never did anything wrong, but really, it just isn't that bad. Okay? I've never done anything like making a man kneel next to a hole that already has the bodies of his family in it and then shooting him in the head. All right? In fact, people that do things like that, those people are really bad. And so I can see where maybe those people should go to hell. I think I can get on board with a whole category of sins that are so bad that the people that do them should go to hell. Okay, people need to answer for the horrible things that they do. But people like me, I've never done anything that would belong in that category. Okay? And that is just how the vast majority of us view the hierarchy of sin. There are really bad sins, but the bad ones are the ones that I do not do. They're the ones that other people do. But is this view that we have of the hierarchy of sin the same as the view that God has of sin? And I think that we can clearly point out that God has a slightly different view than ours. Okay, Proverbs 16:2 says all the ways of man are clean in his own sight, but the Lord weighs the spirit. God looks right past the superficial. He looks past all of our definitions of bad. He looks right past all of our rationalizations and our excuses, and he looks right at the spirit. And at the level that God is looking at, we're all the same. Okay, so this again is our view of the sin graph. So the basic construction of the graph looks like this. It has some arbitrary line on it where, like, above that line, the sins are really bad, and below that line, where our personal sin is not that big of a deal. But God's sin graph is different. Okay, it looks a lot more like this. And he might also agree with you that shooting an old man is worse than whatever it is that you're into. Okay, but all of those things are pretty bad as far as he's concerned. And the category of people that deserve to go to hell includes everyone on the graph. Okay, so he's working off of a completely different standard than we are. And so we're like in the mud, wallowing around with other pigs, and so if a pig looks dirtier to us, that doesn't make us clean. Okay, we all hold up ourselves as the standard of good. And God is holding up himself as the standard and he's the one that's right. Okay, and so he's looking at all this from a standard of absolute perfection. And so to him, all of this stuff looks pretty bad. All the pigs are dirty. Okay, and so about this subject, Jesus said, "He who is not with me is against me, and he who does not gather with me scatters." So what should God do with the humans that come against him? And so a lot of people would say that they're, personally not against God. And it just isn't true. Okay, you are against God. And if you maintain that you don't need God, or if you don't need to follow God, then you're against God. Okay, he says that you do need him, and you do need to follow him. You're a pretty lost person that has a predisposition that is against God and that needs to be resisted. And so following God is not some random choice that some people make. It is a moral obligation that all creatures that are created in his image have. Okay, he's God, and we're his creatures. We should be willing to follow him. Okay, and every time that we don't fully see the need for that, we're calling God a liar. And that's pretty serious. Okay, it's serious enough to land you squarely in the category of the judgment of God. All right, so we read verse 32 already, but it said that they are fully aware of God's death penalty for those who do these things. And so a lot of people decide that, they don't want to follow a God that operates like this. They're not interested in this kind of thing. Really? Is that what you're going to tell God when you appear in front of him? Okay? You're offended that he would judge people? I'm not sure that you get a vote in how all this works. Okay? Your objections are going to be overruled. We may not like the idea of the judgment of God, but that doesn't make it not the case. And I think that if we really look at the way that things work, we can see why he would do things this way, if we're all free choosing and therefore responsible beings. Okay, the Bible's pretty clear that the judgment of God is a very real thing. It's dangerous and it's scary. Okay, being judged by an almighty and perfect God does not sound like a very good deal for us. It should be a little bit scary. Okay, and if this situation is true, then this is a desperate situation for us. Every one of us is on the wrong place on God's sin graph. Okay, we stand under the judgment of God, and we're headed towards a very negative future. Okay, we got some major problems if that's the end of the story. All right, but fortunately, it's not the end of the story. God has not left it there. God's been very active to fix this whole thing. And so it's easy to see him as kind of passive on this point. He gives them over, right? He lets people do what they want. Seems like a pretty passive approach. But he's actually been very active the whole time. He's had a plan from the very beginning. And when God looked down on humanity, his righteous judgment was stirred. His own nature insisted that he judged the situation. Okay, he couldn't pretend that this stuff wasn't happening. The stuff that was going on needed to be answered for, and justice needed to be served. But God also has this thing going on where he's a God of love. And he really loves these human beings that he has created. He loves you. And he even loves me. Okay, but he feels compelled to judge us. So there's this dilemma. All right, is God going to serve his love for people and ignore his justice, or will he serve his justice on people and ignore his love? And it turns out that neither one of those things is correct. And the solution is that God came in the person of Jesus and absorbed his own judgment himself. Justice was served. Every evil was punished right there on the cross by the infinite personal God himself while he was incarnated into humanity. This is a wild solution to this dilemma. It's hard to believe that God would do something this extreme. But that's what the Bible says he did. Okay, it is a radical solution that nobody saw coming. And this whole problem has been solved. And even though we deserve a death sentence of God, we can get out of that. All of humanity lies under the judgment of God, but if you'll set aside your pride and accept the forgiveness that's offered to you through the cross, then your sinfulness will be completely covered over with the righteousness of Jesus, and you will pass out of judgment. Okay, God has already paid the price, and we're free to go. But you have to receive the gift. It's the only caveat. We still have our free choice. It's up to you. And so are you going to be so proud that even if God is giving you eternal life and sparing you from judgment completely free of charge, you're just not interested? It's not that good a plan. Okay, and so when we say that we don't want to accept that Jesus paid for our sins, then what we're really saying is that we want to pay for them ourselves. And that's exactly what will happen. Okay, and this is part of the biblical answer to evil. All right, and it's really extraordinary to me that when you see things from a biblical perspective, just about every single blank is filled in. There are answers to all of the questions, except maybe one. Okay, why does God let the situation go on? All right, what's the point in not putting an end to the Holocaust that we live in? And so this question and answer are a bit beyond the scope of what we're going to study this morning. Does come up in Romans, though, a little bit later. You may just have to keep coming back to hear the answer. But I'll tell you right now, is that he will intervene. Okay, that part's coming. But there are some very good reasons for why he might be putting it off. So this whole experiment with our revolt and his salvation of us is a one-time event. And he's going to let it develop fully so that we will remember and will never be quite this foolish again. And so even though we will continue to be just as free as we could possibly be as personal beings, we'll have this history behind us to refer to that's going to teach us that living without God is not that good of an idea. All right, and to save the billions of citizens of the universe that do turn to God, this whole thing was most assuredly worth it from God's point of view. Okay, so that's the call that he made. And so that's kind of an outline of the biblical response to the problem of evil. And, we're going to quit there for this morning. Not next week, but the week after, we're going to go into Romans 2, where Paul points out that God is against religion. Okay, he makes the case that religion is a great deceiver and that people who buy into religion are falling for this terrible thing because they think that they are closer to God because of their religion, but they're really no closer at all, maybe even further from God. It doesn't do them any good at all. And then we're going to read a bit of chapter 3, where Paul kind of summarizes this man without the Bible from here in chapter 1 and the religious man from chapter 2. And he gives us kind of a full picture of the work of Christ and how it applies to both of these guys.